Yes, and welcome to Helsinki, the Finnish capital in the Baltic Sea, which has for decades now been a bridge between East and West. But in the Helsinki Summit 2018, taking place, an American president and a Russian leader at a time when Finland is now a member of the European Union and a privileged partner of NATO. But Finnish officials tell us this is still the place to meet, describing it as reliable and predictable. Perhaps the best place to have a very unpredictable summit. In fact, some American officials are saying, don't call it a summit, it's just a meeting. Don't call it formal, it's just informal. There's no fixed agenda, there's been little preparation, and of course, there's a lot of Trumpian unpredictability about today's meeting. But there is a lot of history here, and history could be made in Helsinki. In a moment, we'll discuss the prospects for what lies ahead. But first, let's take a look at what the two leaders could be discussing. First of all, their nuclear arsenals. Both leaders boast about them. But an arms race is both dangerous and expensive. So an agreement to extend the new START nuclear arms treaty, which expires in 2021, would be a win for both sides. President Trump is under pressure to bring up Russian election meddling, although President Putin is certain to again deny that Russia tried to influence the 2016 presidential race. U.S. intelligence agencies believe it did. President Trump takes issue with that assessment. Crimea, another big issue. Since Russia's annexation in 2014, NATO has boosted its military presence in Eastern Europe. But if President Trump suddenly agrees to scale back military exercises, that would be a huge win for Mr. Putin and enrage NATO allies. Then there's Ukraine. The U.S. provides it with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military aid, and Russia wants that to stop. In return, President Putin could make concessions over eastern Ukraine, where pro-Moscow separatists control large swathes of territory. Then Syria. Both men may want a deal. President Trump wants to pull out his 2,000 troops and curb Iran's influence. President Putin wants to protect President Assad's rule, as well as Russia's own sway in Syria. And finally, sanctions imposed over Ukraine will be at the top of the Russian leader's agenda. He'd like them eased, but that requires the U.S. Congress, which opposes any such move. So that is the range of issues that could possibly come under discussion here today. We know that the Russian and American presidents will first meet on their own for about an hour and a half, just accompanied by their interpreters. And the big question, of course, is will there be a Russian and an American interpreter, not like one of the other meetings before on the sidelines of a dinner that took place. Then there are about 3 hours of talks where their aides will be brought in, including the Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, and also the American Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. The fact the meeting is taking place at all is a victory for both men. They want to be seen to be meeting with each other. But how will they get along, and what will they really discuss in terms of substance? Let's bring in from Berlin, Derek Chollet, who is a former Pentagon official, and now he's Executive Director for Defense and Security Policy at the German Marshall Fund. I'm also joined here at our site here in Finlandia Hall in Helsinki by Andrew Roth, who is the Moscow correspondent for Britain's Guardian newspaper. If I can first ask you, Andrew Roth, you were on the streets of Helsinki yesterday, and you wrote an article called "The Spirit of Helsinki." Many want to say that East meets West here, American and formerly Soviet leaders, because of the perceived neutrality of Finland, but no more. They want to send a different message.
Well, I think the message, is quite nuanced from what we saw yesterday, and there were protests coming out to meet both of these leaders. I think that for many Finns, basically, they're very proud of their legacy of holding some of the most important summits of the Cold War here in 1975 and also in 1990, but don't call Finland or Helsinki neutral ground, I think was the message that many of them wanted to send. This country is firmly in the West, they've wanted to say, and they're not sort of held back by a policy during the Cold War called Finlandization, where they really had to think about moderating their tone between the Soviet Union and the United States.
But they still have this great geographic location on the Baltic Sea, close to Russia. President Putin will arrive from Moscow in a very short time, basking in the glow of hosting the World Cup. What expectations will he bring here, do you think?
I think that for President Putin, I mean, the biggest issue, the biggest thing that he wants to see when he comes here are the optics of the meeting. I think that the fact that it's happening at all, the fact that he and Trump are meeting, several years after elections meddling allegations, after the annexation of Crimea, the fact that this meeting is happening at all, especially for Putin, is a very big success. I think that in many ways the two leaders are going to be eager to avoid the things that they either disagree on or can't make progress on. Sanctions, Donald Trump is rather limited, also on Ukraine. But I think Syria is a very big opportunity for both of them, and they'll both be looking for some kind of deal. And both want to come out of this meeting and declare victory. Both of them at the end are going to want to say, I'd met with my counterpart and I was able to win this for us.
Well, stay with us for a moment, Andrew. We're going to go bring in from Berlin, Derek Chollet of the German Marshall Front. Derek Chollet, can this really be a win-win summit for both President Putin and President Trump?
Well, certainly the fact that the meeting is happening at all is seen by both leaders as a win. President Putin wants nothing more than to be on the stage in Helsinki, which is so identified with superpower summits of the Cold War, and be seen as a co-equal with the United States. And Donald Trump, for a variety of reasons, values this relationship with Vladimir Putin. He's said repeatedly over the years that he wants to have a good relationship with Putin almost at any cost. And actually having a good relationship with Putin is quite easy if you just do everything that he wants. And that's what has so many Americans and Europeans concerned, is what will Donald Trump give away in the cause of having a good relationship with Vladimir Putin?
As you know, President Trump has upended traditional diplomacy in so many ways, and today in Helsinki he'll be putting the high-level summit at the start of what could be of a diplomatic process instead of at the end. It's been so difficult for consecutive American presidents to reset relations with Russia. Worth trying a different way?
I think it's perhaps worth trying, although most American presidents have found out very quickly that Vladimir Putin is not particularly interested in cooperating with the United States if it means conceding on things that are of his core interests. His strategic goals have been quite clear. It's a weakened European Union, it's a divided NATO, it's a US and Europe that are going their separate ways. And so in many respects, what Donald Trump has given him are gifts that Vladimir Putin really hasn't had to do much to earn. Donald Trump could have been going into this summit with the wind at his back, with a NATO alliance that's unified, with a European Union and the United States that are growing ever stronger together. Instead, Donald Trump is served up Putin pretty much everything he wants. He just yesterday called the EU a trade foe of the United States. Of course, the NATO summit was among the most divisive NATO summits that I think we've ever seen in the history of the alliance. And so I can imagine that if Vladimir Putin enters this meeting in their long one-on-one session later this morning and talks about how the United States has wasted money on European allies and that NATO is something that is not worth the U.S. time and interest, that would actually appeal to Donald Trump, because he said many similar things.
President Trump is famously unpredictable, but you worked with the Obama administration, you worked with the Pentagon. The Pentagon, at least, may be more predictable. What would the team around President Trump want to get out? We look at the START treaty, nuclear treaty. You look at the wars in Ukraine and Syria. Would they be coming here hoping to get something out substantively?
Well, I think clearly on nuclear weapons, there's an opportunity for both presidents to extend the New START agreement, which is set to expire just in a few years. That's something actually we might be able to expect, because I think Vladimir Putin is interested in doing that, and Donald Trump has suggested that he as well is interested in some sort of nuclear deal. Again, that harkens back to the Cold War summits, where agreements on nuclear arms control were the core agreements of those summits. I think certainly the Pentagon in particular in the United States will be hoping that Donald Trump does not make any concessions along the lines of U.S. troop presence in Eastern Europe, does not seek to walk back the U.S. military assistance to Ukraine. So my sense for most in Washington, what they're hoping to get out of this summit is frankly not a lot of news. There's very low expectations that Vladimir Putin is going to give much of anything, whether it's on Ukraine or whether it's on Syria. I think there's more concern in Washington and throughout the NATO alliance that Donald Trump is prone to make news by giving something away for nothing.
Derek Chollet of the German Marshall Fund, and thank you also to Andrew Roth of The Guardian. So the big question of the hour here in Helsinki: what will the two leaders give away and what will they get?